It is the moment you've all been waiting for. You've been watching the Olympic opening ceremonies. It's been a couple hours, and now the time has finally come for the lighting of the Olympic cauldron. It's a closely guarded secret who will actually light the Olympic cauldron. But anticipation builds as that flame finally reaches the top of the cauldron to be lit. Did you know that lighting the Olympic cauldron is a tradition that's not even 100 years old? Today we're going to look over some of the history and traditions of the Olympic Games in the opening ceremony, during the Olympics, and in the closing ceremony. Traditions of the opening ceremony, some have been around for, well, since the beginning. Back in 1896, when the modern games were resurrected, some traditions were started right at the beginning. First one being the Parade of Nations. The Parade of Nations has always been a part of the Olympic Games. And what it was is all the country's athletes would march in under the flag of their country. It was a great way for nations to parade and show off their colors. And over the time, as more nations became part of the Olympic movement, the Parade of Nations has grown. Today, the Parade of Nations can last anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours. However, there really has been no movement in terms of getting rid of it or cutting it short, because it's one of the highlights of the opening ceremonies. It's a great way for smaller nations to get on the world stage, so to speak. Second tradition that's always been a part of the opening ceremonies, or at least started in the opening ceremonies, was the Olympic hymn. According to EliteDaily.com, the Olympic hymn was first composed by a Greek writer named Spiros Samras. He wrote the hymn for the opening games of the 1896 Olympic Games in Athens, the very first games. But after that games, the hymn wasn't used for actually quite a while. And it wasn't until 1950 that the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, adopted it as its official anthem. Now, anytime the Olympic flag is raised or lowered, the Olympic hymn is played. Some traditions grew over time. For instance, one of the most easily recognizable symbols in the world is the Olympic rings. 5 rings, each with different colors, one of which is appearing on every single country's flag in the world, on a white background to symbolize peace. This design was not actually created at the beginning of the Olympic Games in 1896. It was designed by Pierre de Coubertin, who originated the Games in 1913. But it actually wasn't used until the Antwerp Games of 1920. The symbol was very appropriate for those games because the 1920 Games were the first games to be held after World War I. So having a unifying symbol on a white background with peace, as symbolizing peace, was very appropriate for the time. Another popular staple of the opening ceremonies is the torch relay. But did you know that the torch relay was actually developed by the Nazis? The 1936 Games were to be held in Berlin, Germany. And the Third Reich at the time wanted to do something that would make their games stand out. So they designed a relay that would start in Olympia, Greece, where the original site of the ancient Olympic Games was. A relay of torches that would carry the Olympic flame to the stadium in Berlin. It was wildly successful. In fact, so successful that even after World War II, the first games to be held after World War II were in London, and an Olympic flame was lit in Greece and run all the way to London. During the Winter Games, though, the Winter Games do the same thing. However, instead of lighting the flame in Olympia, originally, the Winter Games lit the flame in Norway, in the fireplace of Sondre Norheim, who was the pioneer of skiing and a very influential figure in winter sports. This lasted until about 1964 when the IOC changed its mind and had the flame originate in Olympia. There are some traditions that grew in the Olympic Games themselves. One of them actually affected sport throughout the world. This is the marathon. Prior to 1908, a marathon was only 42 kilometers long. Marathon was one of the original events of the Olympic Games and a crowd favorite. Therefore, in 1908, when the Games were held in London, they wanted to make sure that the marathon ended in the Olympic Stadium where everyone was gathered. Problem? The course wasn't long enough. The finishing line, they wanted the finishing line to end right underneath the royal box so that the king could get the best view of the finish. So, because it wasn't long enough, the officials added 195 extra meters to the race, which is actually still there today. All marathons today are 42 kilometers and 195 meters long. And just as a kind of a funny note, the winner of this race, particularly according to Olympic.org, is Dorando Pietri of Greece. You see him winning the finishing line there, crossing the finish line first. However, fortunately, he was disqualified because he had received assistance, outside assistance, to get across the finish line. So, unfortunate for him. Now here's another interesting one. Biting metals. According to the Washington Post, biting metals harkens back to when merchants would bite coins to make sure that they were authentic. Now, you're probably expecting me to tell you that there's some tradition in which an athlete doubted the authenticity of their gold medal. There isn't. There actually is no real reason why athletes bite their medals in the Olympic Games, except for a photo op. But it's something that has grown now to the point where where it's almost difficult to find pictures of athletes who aren't biting medals now in today's media. So that's a little interesting tidbit. Some traditions have grown out of seemingly nowhere. Now, in terms of the closing ceremonies, one of our favorite traditions in the closing ceremonies is the Parade of Athletes. Much like the opening ceremonies, where all the athletes come into the stadium together, the closing ceremonies have the same thing, except, in this case, the athletes do not march under their country's flag. This was actually changed in 1956 for the Melbourne Games in Australia. A young Australian by the name of Ian Wing thought it would be a good sign of peace to have all the athletes marching together in one large group. The organizers liked that idea so much that, according to Olympic.org, the change was made and has stuck and is that way today. A final tradition that we'll talk about today is the flag handover ceremony. This is a ceremony in which an official Olympic flag, in this case what's called the Antwerp flag, is handed from the mayor of the host city, current host city, to the mayor of the next host city. In this case, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro hands the flag to the governor of Tokyo, in which now that flag will sit in City Hall for the next 4 years until the Olympic Games in 2020. This tradition was actually originally a part of the opening ceremony, but because it made more sense, they moved it to the closing ceremony, which is where I think is much more fitting. So these are just some of the traditions that we have had over the few years, or over the last several Olympic Games, and have shaped how things are done today. So the next time that you are watching the Olympic Games with your family and friends, you can now point to some of these ceremonies that take place and say, I know why they do that. Thank you.